In a bustling city park, a millionaire named Alexander Thompson sat in his wheelchair, a prisoner of his own bitterness. He watched children play, pretending to heal each other with sticks and leaves, their laughter echoing in the air. With a mocking grin, he pointed at one child and challenged him. "I'll give you $1,000,000 if you can cure me." The boy, undeterred, replied confidently, "Prepare the check." Alexander chuckled, dismissing the child's boldness, but something about the boy's unwavering gaze unsettled him. This was not just any child. He had an intensity in his dark eyes that seemed to pierce through Alexander's facade. 5 years prior, Alexander had been a titan in the corporate world, feared and revered as the founder of a multinational empire. But a devastating stroke had left him confined to a wheelchair, his ego intact but his body broken. As he observed the children, he felt a mix of disdain and curiosity. "What a wonderful sight," he scoffed. "Future charlatans training from a young age." The children paused, some frightened, others confused. "Anyone want to cure me too? I'm paralyzed. Maybe with a leaf and a prayer. I'll be doing cartwheels again." His laughter rang out, but the boy remained silent, arms crossed, his expression calm and resolute. "Are you just going to stand there staring, or are you going to pretend to work miracles?" Alexander taunted, leaning closer. The boy simply replied, "Prepare the check." The word struck Alexander like a bolt of lightning, sending a chill down his spine. He attempted to laugh it off, but the boy's confidence unnerved him. The child knelt before Alexander, placed his palm on the ground, and closed his eyes. Alexander watched, feigning boredom, yet unable to look away. The boy gently placed his hand on Alexander's leg, his expression focused. After a few moments, he whispered something inaudible, moved his fingers as if tracing invisible patterns in the air, and then stood up. "Is that it?" Alexander scoffed. "That was your big trick? You lost, kid. $1,000,000 wasted." The boy simply smiled faintly and walked away, disappearing among the trees. Alexander watched him go, a strange sensation stirring in his chest. "Crazy little brat," he muttered, forcing a laugh that fell hollow. Later that evening, back in his luxurious penthouse, Alexander sank into his leather chair, the silence of his marble sanctuary enveloping him. He recalled the boy's serious face and mimicked his voice. "Prepare the check." But as he sipped his whiskey, he felt an odd tingling in his left foot. Dismissing it, he tried to ignore the sensation, but it persisted, growing stronger. He pressed his thigh, feeling warmth there. "No, it can't be," he thought, breath quickening. He pushed against the armrest of his wheelchair, straining. Come on," he whispered, sweat beading on his forehead. With a desperate effort, he stood up. His legs trembled, unsteady like a newborn deer, but he was standing. He stared at his reflection in the hallway mirror, disbelief washing over him. For the first time in 5 years, Alexander Thompson was upright, alone, without assistance. The mocking laughter that once filled his life was replaced by a sacred silence. The boy's words echoed in his mind. "Prepare the check." The next day, Alexander sought answers. He returned to the park, sitting on the same bench, observing every child that passed by. He took notes, described faces, and questioned parents, his former arrogance replaced by a childlike curiosity. Who was that boy? Where did he live? What had he done to him? Days turned into weeks, and the boy remained elusive, a ghost haunting Alexander's thoughts. One afternoon, he spotted a child in a blue shirt and rushed over, breathless. "Hey, are you him?" he asked, but the boy looked confused, and his mother pulled him away protectively. Frustration mounted as he searched for the boy, but no one seemed to remember him. Then, one day, a homeless man mentioned a child living with an elderly woman in a shelter on July 17th Street, number 96, behind an abandoned school. Alexander's heart raced. Without hesitation, he drove to the dilapidated building, its walls crumbling, windows shattered. He knocked on the door, and an elderly woman with weathered skin opened it. "Yes," she asked. "I'm Alexander Thompson. I'm looking for a boy. He cured me. I need to see him." The woman raised an eyebrow. "He cured you? Come in. I'm Carmen, his grandmother." The shelter was filled with the scent of cooking and the sounds of children playing. Carmen led him to a small room where Lucas sat, the boy from the park. "Hello, I'm Alexander," he said, his voice trembling. "I know who you are." Lucas replied, his tone steady. I came to pay my debt. Alexander pulled out an envelope containing a check for $1 million. As promised, it's yours. Lucas didn't even glance at the check. I don't want your money. Alexander was taken aback. What do you mean you don't want it? Why not? Because I don't want anything for myself. But if you want to help everyone here. The words hit Alexander like a punch to the gut. He looked around, finally noticing the dire conditions of the shelter. Families crammed into small rooms, children sleeping on mats, adults struggling to maintain dignity. What happened here, he asked, his voice barely a whisper. We lost everything, Carmen replied, stepping forward. One day we had homes, and the next, they were gone. They demolished our community, without warning. She handed him a yellowed newspaper clipping with a headline about a new real estate development promising record profits, featuring Alexander's company logo and a photo of him shaking hands with investors. I didn't know, he murmured, feeling the weight of guilt settle over him. I swear I never saw names or faces. It was just another project. Development, Carmen spat. That's what they call it. But it's destruction. Lucas stepped closer, his eyes blazing with indignation. That's the lie you tell yourself, that it's just business. You're not just destroying buildings. You're destroying lives. Why did you help me? Alexander asked, his voice cracking. Why did you do that for me? Because sometimes even those who destroy can still repair something, Lucas replied softly. Alexander stood there, holding the newspaper clipping, finally seeing the cracks in a reality he had chosen to ignore. The voices of the adults faded, and for a moment, he was surrounded by children, each one carrying the weight of a story he had helped write without ever reading a single line. That night, sleep eluded him. In his luxurious bed, the eyes of Lucas haunted him, and the newspaper clipping lay crumpled on his nightstand. Carmen's words, Lucas's calm yet powerful voice, all pierced through him. For the first time, he didn't see himself as a successful man. He saw himself as a villain of the story, a villain who hadn't even known he was one. Before dawn, he dressed simply and left his apartment, as if fleeing from himself. The next morning, he returned to the shelter, not with briefcases or checks, but with bags of food, fresh fruits, hygiene products, and new mattresses. He didn't introduce himself. He simply sat on the floor with a child playing with toy cars, helping to build a makeshift racetrack. Later, he served soup in the kitchen, wearing an apron borrowed from Carmen, learning how to handle a ladle without spilling. He watched the faces of the children, some wary, others with a precocious maturity. A boy with a scar on his chin smiled as he received 2 slices of bread. A little girl hugged her plate as if it were a gift. Do they always react like this? He asked Carmen, his voice thick with emotion. When someone truly cares, yes, she replied. But they've learned to recognize those who come to ease their own guilt. Lucas, who had been quietly sewing a strap on a backpack, looked up. He doesn't talk much, does he? Alexander asked. He speaks when it matters, Carmen replied. But when he speaks, the world listens. Alexander nodded, realizing he wanted to listen, to understand, to see what he had never seen. He sat with Ramon, a man with a thick beard and calloused hands, listening to the story of how he built his own house with 40 years of savings, only to see it reduced to rubble in minutes. He sat with Lucia, a single mother of 3, who shared how she slept in shifts, first the kids, then herself, because there was only one mattress for all 4 of them. He listened to the voices of those who had been evicted without warning, treated as statistics, ignored by people who only saw graphs. He listened and felt. With each story, he felt the ground beneath him sink, realizing the weight of his past decisions. Carmen watched from a distance, recognizing when a man was being disarmed from within, and Alexander was. It was evident in the way he bent down to play with a little girl, how he cleaned the floor without being asked, how he looked at each face as if memorizing every line of expression. Just a day before, he had been the symbol of the machine that crushed them. Now he was just another human trying to comprehend the damage he had caused. You're back, Lucas said, finally approaching him. Alexander smiled faintly. I had to come back. This doesn't fix what you did, the boy said, looking him in the eye. I know, Alexander replied softly. But maybe it's a start. In that makeshift shelter, filled with the smell of burnt rice and the laughter of children echoing through the narrow hallways, something unprecedented was happening. The businessman who once viewed people as statistics now saw every child, every face, every story as a reflection of the moral failure he had ignored for years. The children's laughter still echoed that evening when Carmen, always so active and firm, dropped the pot she was holding. The sound of aluminum hitting the floor was sharp, interrupting the lively conversation between Alexander and a group of children. Lucas, who had been drawing with chalk on the terrace, turned with alarm. "Grandma!" he called, seeing her sway. Carmen tried to speak, but her voice faltered. Her hand trembled, her body swaying like a tree about to fall. Within seconds, she collapsed, her eyes half closed, her face pale and sweaty. Lucas rushed to her side, kneeling, unsure of what to do except scream. "No, Grandma, stay with me. Stay with me." Alexander arrived moments later, pushing the children aside, heart racing. Carmen, listen to me." Lucas had his hands on her chest, just as he had done with Alexander before. He closed his eyes tightly, trying to repeat the gesture, the touch, the whisper. Nothing. No response. "Please," he murmured, desperation rising. Listen to me again." Tears streamed down Lucas's face as he tried again and again. "Lucas, we need to take her to the hospital now," Alexander said, his voice firm, almost a command. Lucas resisted. "Wait, it's not over yet. It's over. She needs medical help." Alexander's voice was harsh, desperate, almost commanding. He lifted Lucas off her, away from Carmen, who lay unconscious. He called for help from 2 women in the shelter, grabbed the car keys, and within minutes, they were on their way to the hospital. In the back seat, Lucas trembled, watching his grandmother through the rearview mirror, as if fearing it would be the last time. At the hospital, Alexander spared no effort. He rushed to reception, shouting for immediate attention, demanding priority, showing documents, making calls, threatening to sue the entire hospital if they didn't act. Doctors arrived, wheeling Carmen away on a stretcher, disappearing through an emergency door. Lucas sat on the cold floor, hugging his knees, eyes fixed on the hallway. He no longer cried. The tears had turned to silence, a silence so thick that Alexander couldn't bear it. He sat beside him, both breathing in unison. After nearly an hour, a doctor emerged, a middle-aged man with a tired face and a coffee-stained coat. "She's stable, but the situation is grave," he said, looking directly at Alexander. "She has advanced kidney disease, very advanced. We don't have much time." "What needs to be done?" Alexander asked, ready to open his wallet. "She needs an urgent transplant." Otherwise, the doctor didn't need to finish the sentence. Lucas stood slowly, looking at the doctor. "She's going to die." The man hesitated. "If we can't find a compatible donor, yes." Lucas's face fell. "I tried to heal her. I tried," he whispered, "but it didn't work. It didn't work. It didn't work." The tears returned, and he slumped against the wall, sliding down to the floor, as if the weight of reality was too much for his small body. Alexander crouched in front of him, trying to hold his shoulders, but Lucas recoiled. "Why did it work for you?" he murmured through sobs. "Why not for her? She always took care of everyone. She taught me everything. Why her?" A new rage surged within Alexander, not against Lucas or the doctors, but against himself, because even now, with all the money in the world, he couldn't simply fix it. Yelling, paying, ordering wasn't enough. He couldn't buy a kidney. He couldn't give Lucas back what he was about to lose. For the first time, he felt the desperation of a parent without ever having been one. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said, voice trembling, eyes red. "I promise you I'll find a way." That night, while Lucas slept against the cold glass of the hospital window, Alexander stood, watching Carmen through glass, surrounded by monitors beeping as if they had their own life. That IT had been easy to build empires, expand capital, make decisions from a distance, but now, facing fragility of that woman, who hadn't even hated him upon learning the truth, he felt useless, small, human. For the first time, he desperately wanted to be part of the cure, not the destruction. The next day, with dark circles under his eyes and an unshaven beard, Alexander called a doctor privately. "I want to be tested," he said bluntly. I want to know if I'm a match. Mr. Thompson, it's a serious procedure. The surgery is delicate. There are risks. I said I want to donate, he repeated. The greatest risk is that the child loses the only family he has. The test began that very morning. Blood samples, endless questionnaires, clinical evaluations. Alexander answered everything patiently. Something rare for someone like him. He sat in silence between tests, watching Lucas from a distance. The boy walked in circles through the hallways, eyes fixed on the ground, as if carrying a question for the heavens. They hardly spoke during this time. There was no need. An invisible bond formed between them, made of fear and hope. By the end of the day, the doctor returned, folder in hand, a cautious expression on his face. Alexander stood before he could say a word. Tell me, you're a match. Time stopped. Alexander blinked, trying to process it. That means a donation can happen, and it needs to happen soon. We're preparing everything. Lucas, who had been nearby, heard. He said nothing but walked slowly toward Alexander. Eyes glistening with contain emotion. He stopped in front of the man, small against the towering figure, and without a word, extended his hand. Alexander looked at that small hand, marked by time and struggle, and took it. Thank you for trying. Lucas said softly, voice trembling. It was a simple gesture, but one of immeasurable greatness. There was no audience, no speeches, no cameras. Just a boy and a man united by a decision that couldn't be bought. That hand holding his was more powerful than any contract Alexander had ever signed. For the first time, he felt he wasn't just doing something good. He was doing the right thing. Before the surgery, lying on a gurney with wires connected to his arm, Alexander experienced a moment of profound silence. The nurse was already administering the sedative. He turned his face and saw Lucas on the other side of the glass, sitting in a chair with his hands clasped between his knees. They exchanged one last look. It wasn't fear, it was a promise. Alexander closed his eyes and smiled. For the first time, he was giving a part of himself, not out of guilt, but out of love. Hours later, in the recovery room, he awoke to the soft voice of a nurse whispering beside him. The surgery was a success, Mr. Thompson. He tried to move but couldn't. He was weak, but upon hearing the news, a solitary tear rolled down his cheek. And Carmen, she's still in observation, but she's responding well. We believe she's going to recover. The curtain slowly opened, and there was Lucas, disheveled hair, red eyes. He approached cautiously, as if entering a temple. He stopped beside the bed and remained silent for a few seconds. Then he simply said, "You saved my grandmother." Alexander wanted to respond, but his voice failed him. He just smiled weakly, tired but at peace. I end that room, devoid of luxury, without a panoramic view, without marble. Alexander Thompson experienced the most valuable moment of his life, because there, without companies, without fortune, without power, he was a complete man. Weeks passed since the surgery. The sun finally shone over the city again, and within the shelter, still improvised but more alive than ever, the routine seemed to breathe relief. Carmen, now stronger, walked slowly down the hallway with the aid of a cane borrowed from the hospital. With each step, smiles blossomed. Children surrounded her as if she were the very pillar of the shelter. Lucas watched from a distance, smiling discreetly, still bearing traces of the anguish lived, but now supported by a new certainty. She was going to be okay, and Alexander was no longer just a visitor. That morning, he returned to the shelter earlier than usual. He didn't bring bags, donations, or food. He came with something else, a small cardboard box tucked in his jacket pocket. He looked thinner, more serene. His stride was no longer haughty, but he still carried an imposing presence, now accompanied by something he had never had before. Humility. He searched for Lucas, who was sitting on the steps at the entrance, drawing with a charcoal pencil in an old notebook. Alexander approached, sat beside him, and for a moment, neither spoke. "I promised you something," Alexander said, breaking the silence. "And promises are meant to be kept." Lucas looked up slowly. "Did you keep it?" "Not exactly how I said." Alexander pulled out the small box from his pocket, opened it carefully, and took out a white envelope. Inside was a real check, signed and sealed, for $1 million. He extended it to Lucas. "It's yours. Promise." The boy looked at the paper for a few seconds, his expression unchanged, solemn, deep. He took the check delicately, as if holding something fragile. Alexander watched, waiting for any reaction. Surprise, joy, rejection. But Lucas simply stood up. Without saying a word, he walked a few steps forward, holding the check between his fingers. Carmen, watching from the terrace, also paused. The adults fell silent. The children, as if instinctively, interrupted their games. There was something solemn in the air. Then, in a calm yet incredibly powerful gesture, Lucas began to tear the check. First, a cut down the middle, then into 4 pieces. The sound of the paper shredding sliced through the silence with impressive clarity. There was no music, no rehearsed words, just the sound of paper fragmenting, as if it were the very symbol of Alexander's world disintegrating before his eyes. He tore the last piece firmly, letting the fragments fall slowly to the concrete floor, and looked back at Alexander. "You've already paid," he said. Alexander remained motionless, a lump in his throat preventing him from speaking. The scene was so symbolic, so pure, that he didn't dare interrupt it with useless words. He felt his eyes burn, but he didn't care. For the first time, his silence wasn't arrogance. It was reverence. Lucas sat back down, took his notebook, and resumed drawing as if the previous gesture had been just another detail of the day. But for Alexander, it was everything. Alexander had always believed his greatest skill was turning things into profit. But in the days that followed that silent gesture from Lucas, the torn check before everyone, he began to see the world from a new perspective. Some things should not be turned into capital. Some things must be returned. And so began the reconstruction. It wasn't announced at conferences or recorded in business columns. It was discreet, firm, made of silent calls and meetings without suits or luxury watches. Alexander sold part of his assets quietly, without fanfare. He ceded shares, liquidated funds, dissolved old investments the first time, not to gain but to give back. The land where Carmen's village once stood, the same one his company had demolished, was purchased again. With the money from the sale of his shares, Alexander initiated the reconstruction of the houses. Every brick, every roof, every paint on the walls now carried a name, a story, a memory. But he didn't just finance the project. He was there with paint-stained hands, handing out gloves, supervising renovations, bringing lunches to the workers. At first, the neighbors looked at him with suspicion, then with surprise, and finally with gratitude. But Alexander didn't stop there. Using part of the remaining capital, he founded an educational project in honor of the woman who transformed him, the Carmen Institute. The project served children in vulnerable situations, offering academic support, artistic activities, nutrition, and psychological counseling. Lucas was the first to step into the newly painted classroom, with new desks, a whiteboard, and shelves filled with books. He walked slowly among the furniture, touching the walls as if he couldn't believe it was all real. And Alexander, standing at the door, simply watched, feeling his heart beat with a rhythm he didn't know. Light, alive, complete. It was on a golden afternoon that the most symbolic scene of all occurred. The park where it all began, the one where Alexander had mocked children in faith months before, now looked different. He had sponsored the renovation of the space. The sandy ground was replaced with new grass. The playground restored, painted in bright colors. But more than that, there was something new in Alexander. The gesture. He was there, dressed in a simple t-shirt, handing out toys with his own hands. From a large box, he pulled out dolls, balls, cars, and colored pencils. "Take one, just one, okay? Leave some for the others too," he said. Smiling, mothers passing by the park stopped to watch. Some whispered to each other in disbelief. "Is he the one from the scandal?" "No, it can't be." "Yes, it is. The millionaire, the one who donated the kidney." But he didn't respond. He continued serving fresh lemonade in a plastic cup to 2 children, competing to see who could drink faster. He laughed with them genuinely, as he hadn't in years, perhaps never before. Later, sitting on a park bench, Alexander looked around. He saw children running, swinging on the playground, kicking balls. He saw Lucas sitting under a tree, reading a book intently. He felt the wind on his face, and for a moment, he closed his eyes. It was as if the universe had finally stopped weighing down on his shoulders. There, among the laughter, children, and the smell of freshly made popcorn, Alexander Thompson was no longer the man of the empire. He was just a man saved by a child and by everything that couldn't be calculated. Years passed like leaves carried by the wind. The shelter became a school. The school became a reference. The project transformed into a model for other forgotten communities. But for Alexander Thompson, none of that mattered as much as what would happen on that specific day. The date was marked on a calendar of memory. The first vocational seminar of the Carmen Institute. The auditorium was full. Children sat in folding chairs. Mothers leaned against the side walls. Volunteers balanced glasses of juice and notebooks. Alexander sat in the back row, discreetly, with a small bouquet of flowers in his lap, eyes fixed on the stage. Then he saw Lucas, now a teenager, taller, more confident, wearing a white coat that seemed too big for his body, but just right for his destiny. He walked onto the stage without hesitation. Taking the microphone calmly, he waited for silence to form. His eyes scanned the audience until they found Alexander, and he smiled. "My name is Lucas, and I want to be a doctor." The phrase, spoken simply, filled the room with a dense silence. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it, the weight behind the words. He took a deep breath and continued. "I want to help people like my grandmother Carmen, who is alive today thanks to a gesture that changed 2 lives. I want to be by the side of those who suffer, just as someone once was by mine. I want to remember every day that a miracle is not just what one hopes for, but what one chooses to be for others." A murmur swept through the hall. Some mothers wiped their eyes, others smiled silently. Alexander didn't blink. That boy who had once challenged him with a "prepare the check" in the middle of a park was now making him cry with the strength of a vocation. When the talk ended, applause filled the room. Lucas stepped off the stage and walked straight toward him. "Did you bring flowers?" he asked, teasing with a smile. "Of course, for your grandmother." But now, Alexander handed the bouquet to the boy. "I think they're yours." "I'm not a child anymore, Alexander. I know, but you'll always be the boy who healed me." They embraced right there, in the middle of the crowd. A long hug, filled with everything that was never said. There were not enough words to explain that bond, and none were needed, for in that moment, it was clear to everyone. Alexander was no longer just a donor of a kidney. He was the spiritual father of someone who transformed his life and, through him, the lives of many others. As they left the auditorium, Alexander paused for a moment and looked up at the sky. The sun shone brightly, just like the day it all began, but now he saw it differently. And for the first time, he understood what Lucas had said that afternoon, years ago. Some destroy, but they can still repair something. He had destroyed much, but now he knew. The true legacy of a man is not in what he builds with concrete, but in what he rebuilds with love. And on that golden afternoon, with the white coat disappearing among the children, Alexander smiled, not for what he had done, but for finally understanding that sometimes there's a child who teaches us what it means to be a man. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Leave a like to support us and activate notifications so you don't miss any updates. It helps us keep creating the best for you. Until the next video.